My name is David Matson. I'm a researcher. I've spent most of my life studying grizzly bears and mountain lions. But today I'm going to talk about how trains and railways affect bears, the results of a technical report that I recently produced. I live a little bit south of Livingston, Montana, which is relevant to the story about how trains affect grizzly bears by virtue of the fact that 15 to 20 trains go through Livingston each day. Those trains all head north and eventually transect places where three different populations of grizzly bears live in the lower 48. As the trains pass through, they kill a lot of bears. In fact, they kill many bears each year. In total, probably about 60 bears in the Northern Continental Divide. 3 bears along the margin of the Cabinet Mountains, 1 bear in the Selkirk ecosystem, and that dates back for the last couple of decades. All of our populations of grizzly bears in the lower 48 states are small, and more importantly, they're isolated. So there's no more than a few hundred bears in each population. So even though 9 bears might not sound like many, which is how many bears were killed by train strikes during 2019 in the Northern Continental Divide, that still is more than 10% of all the bears that died for all the reasons they die. All of this begs the question why so many bears are dying along train tracks in the contiguous United States. Well, there's 3 main factors that explain the phenomenon. One has to do with simply topography. The other has to do with the fact that there's attractants that bring bears down to the tracks. And the third factor has to do with the compounding effect, interestingly enough, of highways near the train tracks. So starting with topography, it's perhaps not surprising that train tracks are laid out in major mountain valleys. Valleys that will require the least amount of elevation gain for trains going over the spine of the mountains, which is the case along the southern border of Glacier National Park. But these deep valleys also serve as travel corridors for all sorts of wildlife, including grizzly bears. And you have these side drainages that funnel the bears down to the tracks and concentrate them there. The second major factor is the availability of foods there in addition to the foods that naturally occur. So not only are bears being killed by trains, but also large hooved animals, herbivores like elk, deer, moose, even cattle. And so, of course, if those animals are killed, they become carrion, which attracts scavenging grizzly bears. Also, there's a lot of trains that are moving from the Great Plains west carrying grain. And unfortunately, the hoppers, the cars that carry the grain are not tight. And so there's this constant spillage of grain out of the train hoppers onto the tracks. And of course, grain is a high quality food as well and attracts bears down to the tracks. There's another factor that increases the hazards for bears along train tracks, and that arises from the fact that almost invariably there's a highway next to the railroad. And there's been ample research showing that rather than avoiding train tracks, bears avoid the highways. But because of that, they tend to avoid the highways more often during daylight hours because that's when most of the traffic is. But by selecting for nighttime, bears are then on the tracks, also crossing the tracks at the same time they cross the road at night. And by virtue of it being night, it's dark, and the bears are less well able to detect oncoming trains. People on the trains are less well able to detect the bears, and so it really increases the odds that the bear will end up being hit by the train and almost invariably dies. Fortunately, we know what to do to mitigate the hazards associated with trains and railways. We can assiduously clean up any spilled grain, remove carcasses of animals that have been killed so they aren't attractants. We can install overpasses and underpasses to make for safe passage. And there has been technology developed in the form of lights and sirens or alarms that can be either in fixed positions where we know wildlife crossed the tracks or on the trains themselves to alert the animals well before the train arrives. And this is a big problem, especially if we want to conserve these endangered populations, all of which are protected under the Endangered Species Act.